نور على نور.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد. We first want to thank everyone for joining us today. And we wanted to begin just by introducing the organization and the theme that will be the broad theme that we'll be exploring as an umbrella for this majlis. Just to start with the organization, Shajarat Al Nur. Shajarat Al Nur is dedicated to reviving traditional cognitive frameworks embedded and influenced by the science of the heart, or iḥsan. We draw inspiration from spiritual cultivation to respond to contemporary challenges, while remaining grounded and connected through pursuing excellence and knowledge. Our mission at Shajarat Al Nur is to illuminate the path to the traditional sciences through engaging talks and live events led by renowned scholars, experts, and community members. So the theme that we'll be exploring today is the theme of the suhbah. And this is the Arabic word for, can be translated to companionship. And companionship has been the cornerstone, the beating heart of traditional Islamic communities. Whether through seeking the guidance of a murshid or a guide to gain esoteric knowledge, building Zāwiyahs or communal centers, or spiritual cultivation and craft refinement, or exchanging ideas and cultural inspirations. These practices have paved the way for spiritual blossoming within the Islamic tradition. In this series of talks, we explore this topic steeped in spiritual depth and historical context. And mashallah, we have one of the members of the community, Sayyid Tariq Ismail, who we're extremely grateful for his time and for his willingness to lead this majlis today and to discuss this topic, which is the Zāwiyah of our time. So without any further ado, inshallah, we'd love to shift the spotlight to you, Sayyid Tariq, and Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum, Hamza. Thank you so much for your kind words and the introduction. And I wanted to quickly just reiterate my thanks to all of you for joining the session. And we pray that it will be a fruitful one, inshallah. So as Hamza mentioned, the topic of today is the Zāwiyah of our time. And this is to reimagine the places of remembrance, taking inspiration from our deep tradition in which there were these third spaces, which in the modern world seem to be cropping up all over the place. So I want to get started, firstly, just by, again, welcoming you all to the session and giving you a quick overview of the goals of this workshop. So the first goal is to explore different models of the Zāwiyah of our time. There's some really, really good examples out there, and some of them are even run by people within this room. And for those people, we want to lean on your expertise so that we're not starting afresh, but instead standing on the shoulders of giants when we start to explore this theme. There's also people who may not be so exposed to these spaces, and we want to encourage you all to think about how we can create them in our communities. So the second goal is to explore what the ideal Zāwiyah of our time should look like, what elements there should be, and how they are comparatively with relation to each other. And finally, we want to brainstorm ways in which we can get these projects off the ground, including what a minimal viable product looks like and how to test things with minimal resources. So before getting started, a couple of house rules. Firstly, please be engaged, please collaborate, and be open-minded and respectful to all ideas and to all people involved. So we look forward to getting started now. A quick outline of the next 90 or so minutes. We'll go through a very quick introduction just to highlight some important aspects of modern spaces. And we'll go then to the meat of the discussion, which will take about 45 minutes, in which we'll ideate and we'll really build up what a what the Zāwiyah of our time should really look like. And then at the end, we'll have some next steps, some practicalities, and a wrap up from all of us. So let's get started with community and spaces. I want to very briefly outline the importance of space in our community. So firstly, on the left-hand side, let's talk about what the Zāwiyah was and is, and what sort of roles it fulfilled. So firstly, the Zāwiyah traditionally is a spiritual and religious center. It's also an educational institution, including the education of the self, of adab. Some of these topics we don't have institutions for at the moment that are very widespread in the world. It was also obviously a place where people gathered and could come together. And finally, it was a place where community problems were solved. And these functions met the needs of the community. So there was spiritual guidance, a recalibrating of the self, a place of belonging, place of remembrance, and also it was a place that allowed or facilitated the interdependence of our communities. I also want to talk about modern third spaces. So these are similarly, they have many functions, including being a social hub, being a place of educational and learning, and depending on the flavor, there's various goals, including fitness, academic, having fun, other social goals. And like the Zāwiyah, it has these functions meet specific needs, including just simply having a space for relaxation, for leisure, or for any other purpose. And importantly, with the breakdown of community, it's a place of belonging. And it also provides just that neutral space for people to interact outside the home. In any case, the function of these spaces is to fulfill needs of the community. And that's something I want to get us to think about quite a lot, which is the needs of the community being met by the space, rather than a space being created to possibly solve or possibly meet the needs of the community. So I guess it should be a people-first approach. Now, going on to some examples. We've got 4 examples that we're going to go through, and these were all chosen because they've got very different characteristics. Some have a purpose-built physical space. Some don't even have a physical space. They cater to varying parts of the population, from young to old, but all of them have a specific theme in which way they approach this. So the first one I want to highlight is that of Roots in Dallas, Texas. So in each of these examples, we've highlighted the demographic that it serves and the needs of that demographic. So Roots is a space attached to Qalam Institute, and they focus on spiritual social programs for a wide range of people, generally young adults. So how do they meet the needs of their community? The first thing is obviously to provide a space for people to meet, but that's just a prerequisite. There has to be much more on top of this. So they've got a high quality cafe, and this needs to be called out because it's a coffee shop that wouldn't be out of place in the trendiest parts of London, Dubai, Istanbul. And the coffee there is great. They've really, really invested in this space to ensure that it's a place that people want to spend time at. They choose to go there because the coffee is great. They choose to go there because the ambience is there. They choose to go there because the furnishings are comfortable. And in addition to that, there's something happening almost every single day in terms of programming. So there's sessions with top scholars who dedicate time to teaching content that's relevant to people in a way that's relevant to people. So the content is important, but having someone who can engage people and relate to them is much more important. They're able to take learnings from the tradition and deliver them to people in a relatable and digestible way. And then similar to a traditional Zāwiyah, it's also a place for a person to receive support from a scholar. The next institution I want to go through is Q Club, which is an important London institution that's been going on for many years. The Q Club stands for Quran Club. And what happens over here is that a scholar leads this a group, a majlis, in which he takes the attendees through a tafsir of a surah in a lot of depth. And going through a surah might take up to a few months. It's completely free to attend, although they encourage you to buy a coffee and a cake to support the cafe who's given up their space for this purpose. As I mentioned, it takes place in a cafe. It's very accessible to young professionals working in the city, and it's hosted in a cafe in central London, so people can go straight after work. It normally takes place around 5:30, 6 p.m. So it's very, very accessible and close to where people work. It caters to that demographic and by creating this space. But in contrast to roots that we saw in the previous slide, there is no permanent physical space. There's only two elements that they have, which is people that are willing to learn and people that are willing to teach. That's all they have. And that creates this important institution and space. They are looking to, however, establish a campus in central London, and we pray for tawfiq, inshallah. Lastly, I want to mention another initiative of the wider organization, which is called QRead. So QRead is a one-off event. It happens a couple of times a year, maybe. And it's a beautiful event that takes place in a really nice hotel. And the objective is to finish a complete Quran khatam in that session. So it's very, very simple. And again, there's no physical space. There's only people who want to read the beautiful book. And about 40 or so people attend, and they're each allocated a small amount to read. And after that, there are some refreshments, as well as there's a space for people in that room to meet and to reflect on what they've read and learned. The third institution that we'd like to go through, the third space, is Al Makan, which is a Beirut institution that has many functions and facilities, including a kitchen, a library, workspaces, a souk, and of course, much detailed programmings and event. It has its own space, which is an apartment that's converted for this use. And out of all of the examples that we'll go through, they've got the widest demographic that they serve. And they also have an angle on arts and culture, and it's something that's really apparent when you walk into the building. They also have a big charitable function, and they plan and they aim to serve the community around them. So the space is, I guess, as well as to bring people together, it's bring people together in order to aid other people around them. And finally, I want to talk about the late service at HTB, which stands for Holy Trinity Brompton. Now, this might feel like a bit of a left field example, but I thought it's worth highlighting because they do a really good job of meeting the needs of the community. The community is young Christian professionals who are working in the City of London. And often many of them have moved here and they're looking for religion and they're looking for community. So in summary, this is a church service that takes place at 6:30 p.m. on Sunday. So it's not a traditional morning service. And one major reason they do this is to attract people that can't attend the early service or who may not want to attend that early service. So as I mentioned, the demographic is young professionals who are working in the city, people who are craving community because they've moved to a new city or they're just looking to meet like-minded people. So some similarities with other spaces that we mentioned. The pastor was from within the community and delivered high quality, very relatable content. And similarly to other elements that we mentioned of roots, for example, the production quality of this sermon, of the service, was very, very high. People want to spend time there. People actively take time out of their weekend to come and spend time here, to meet other people, because it is an event that often you'd want to go out of your way to get to. So unlike other spaces, though, this is a space that isn't available all the time. So it's not that you can attend this majlis 24/7 or during the day, etc. It only happens once a week on Sundays at 6:30. But having said that, they do have a few offsites throughout the year, and they've got various socials. So that was a very quick whistle-stop tour of our example spaces and the importance of space in our communities. We want to now move on to the discussion part, which is, as I mentioned, the meat of this workshop, for us really to share ideas and to ideate on the Zāwiyah of our time. A quick reminder of the prep work. There was some very simple reading, and we'd ask you to define a target demographic in your local community and to list all of their needs out. So very shortly, we're going to go around the room and just get ideas and put them on paper so we can start building upon that for the following exercises. So just to orient ourselves in terms of the discussion, we're going to go through the prep exercise output. So we're going to go around the room and get ideas. We're also going to ask for reflections on third spaces that people have visited, that people are part of. And we're then going to go into ideating the ideal Zāwiyah of our time. So at this stage, I'm just going to switch my screen so that it's editable. So see if you give me a few seconds, I'll just do that. You should be able to see the screen now, the PowerPoint itself. Great. So let's get started with our demographics and needs. And we're just going to go around the room, and I guess maybe the best way of doing this is just to go down the list of people I can see, and that'll probably be the easiest way. So I'm just going to call out some cities that are being represented. So the first one I can see is Amman.
Hello. Yeah, I suppose the demographic, I sort of just put anyone who's interested. It's more about what we call like the Amman bubble, is less like the demographic that I grew up in, but I also think it should cater to locals in general, not so much expats, but actually having a sort of Arab hub in that sense. And then the needs that I listed out are pretty abstract. I don't know if they were meant to be more robust, but I wrote down incentive to reflect, a comfortable space for stillness and silence, some sort of space for tactile activity as well, and for large gatherings, because a lot of the local cafes have very small sort of isolated tables, I suppose. And also, I think there's a big need for learning, especially in Arabic. I know that a lot of my friends have the desire to sort of reignite some of that, especially people who've moved away and come back a lot. Yeah, and then the last thing I have down is affordability. Prices are going higher, and I know a lot of people that, you just want somewhere that you don't have to like spend loads of money to be able to hang out in. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's very, very helpful. And yeah, the needs are exactly what we're looking for. But can you just expand a bit about the Amman bubble?
Yeah, again, I'm not sure how to describe it, but it's essentially like, it's this bubble of, I suppose, the upper class, a lot of, I mean, that's where I grew up, and it's a lot of people who you feel very outside of Amman. Like I've been told by people sort of, oh, you're not like a true Jordanian or whatever. Even though like you've grown up in Jordan and you're part of that. But also, so that's like one thing. And then there's also just the, the general younger population who I've been mixing more with since I graduated. But I think if you meet anyone from Amman and you tell them the bubble, then they'll kind of know. I've never had to explain it though.
Perfect, thanks. We'll go down to Muscat.
Sorry, there's two of us trying to decide who's gonna take the first turn. I'll go first. It's interesting to hear about the spaces that you've mentioned before, and it makes me feel like we're a bit blessed in Muscat because coming from like a very like tight community, it feels like people don't really need these spaces all the time. But seeing how people get mixed up with different cultures these days, I feel there is a need to bring these sort of community centers back. Recently, I've heard of one that is more education based. So it's targeting like young adults, people who are transitioning between like school, university, and just starting a job. So that's the demographic I'm trying to focus on here. And also I've seen that because what it affects in the long term, there are these young professionals who are moving into teaching that didn't really have a space to learn how to teach other people. So I think that would also be a target demographic for me.
Perfect, thanks. And the needs, I guess, are as you mentioned, they don't have a space to learn teaching.
Yes, that's one thing. The other thing is just to gather, even though so in Muscat and Oman in general, and I think the whole GCC, we have majalis or diwani or liwan where people would gather culturally through the community and discuss everything. But it became so generic and general that they lost some subjects that are no longer discussed in these places. So if they're more specific on what people want to learn, that would also create a greater impact. I would say to meet like-minded people that share the same interests as you from the topics you want to learn.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We'll go on to Riyadh.
Sure. Right. So the target demographic that I thought of was pre-teens or young teens in Riyadh. And I focused on that because there is a huge youth bulge here in Saudi. Not like under 30, but I chose this group specifically just because I think their needs are really shifting when it comes to like physical and human connection as opposed to digital. They're chronically online. And so I was thinking of a space that would bring them together in a physical space, but not necessarily be like devoid of digital, because then they just won't come. So figuring out a way of having a bit of both, where they they can be online, but then also be together in some way. I think when I thought of it as well, we have these in Riyadh, in the Riyadh city planning, they have each residential neighborhood is mapped around a mosque and a park, but they've kind of left the parks behind, and the focus has become on like the main street where all the shops are, and people just socialize in mosques or at home. So we kind of have these like unused spaces where I would envision having like neighborhood community centers, let's say. And I think it fulfills a challenge as well of Riyadh traffic. Like there's so much traffic in the whole city. So by focusing on specific neighborhoods, there's a way to like revive the neighborhood and then also not be stuck in traffic and connect with neighbors. And I think this group specifically would need a lot of guidance, whether it's spiritual guidance or even like social guidance. I think there's like a new social code with the transformation that's happening. So I think maybe something around that on like how to engage with people in society, especially like different genders. Yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell for now.
Thanks so much. That's very, very helpful. Manila.
Thanks, Tarek. It was a very interesting exercise for me to do this. I think Manila is an interesting case study of a city to think of a Zāwiyah for. The country is 80% Catholic. Manila is 2% Muslim. And so we are a very small minority of city. Maybe a disclaimer is that I didn't grow up Muslim. I grew up Catholic. And so I'm coming also from that perspective, maybe from where I'm sharing. I think with a very small population, and also there's also a long, complex history of boundaries between religions in the country, and remnants of what happened with the American colonization that have put most, if not all, of the Muslim community at an economic disadvantage. And so there's a lot of need there, and there's a lot of need for bringing the community together, because there's no path right now for Catholic Filipinos and Muslim Filipinos to come together in a space. Not saying that the Zāwiyah will serve that purpose, but most of the spaces for Muslims today are in the outskirts of the city, or are in places that are not necessarily safe or accessible, or they're not necessarily beautiful either. You know, they're built with what the community has, and so there's a lot of need. So given that kind of context of Manila, the demographic that I picked, I think that there are three that would be really interesting to bring together in one city, or rather in one space. One are the local Muslims. Many of them have migrated into Manila from the south. Others are returning overseas Filipino workers who have reverted during their time abroad and are now coming back as Muslims. And there's also a very big expat community. And that's obviously a very different demographic, but I think that this space could serve the purpose of what Manila lacks. It sounds very similar to the Amman bubble, where there's not a lot of interaction outside this Manila bubble, I guess is what we would call it. And so given that demographic, I think the needs is, one, a safe space to come together as a community, an accessible space that's beautiful and allows people to pray in peace and without having to worry about their surroundings necessarily. Others, just broader community support, I think, from a learning perspective, and learning about Islam with the same resources that other cities like New York have, for example. And then the third would be general community support economically. I think just given the current demographics, I think there's a lot of opportunity to uplift the community overall. Open to discussing. I think that there are kind of two needs that I'm trying to meet here, where it's like the intellectual and the economic, and I don't know, that maybe it's in steps, but that's how I'm thinking about it right now.
No, thank you very much. And yeah, exactly. I think there are definitely separate needs, for sure. I think as we're going along, we're starting to see a lot of themes emerging across the different cities, and that's actually one of the purposes of this as well. So we'll move on to Kabul.
Sure thing. So Afghanistan is about 50 million population. About 75% of them are under the age of 30. So very, very young population, one of the youngest in the world outside of sub-Saharan Africa. And what I tried to think would be the ideal demographic is to kind of pick that youth, not too young, so they're still, and not too old. So I was thinking maybe 20 to 25 would be the ideal demographic to focus on. And what they need is direction. So they need, spiritual direction. They need economic direction. They need just, to understand. There's a large number that are leaving the country. So there's this, grass is green on the other side kind of mentality that needs to be broken. And so they're going to the West or to neighboring countries for work, or, just they need to understand that there are opportunities and there's ways to be local. So 20 to 25-year-olds, and help them, with leadership and with direction, in Kabul.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Beirut.
Yes. So this was a difficult one considering the current situation. I wanted to include the currently displaced population segment, but I will not. But rather use that group as an indication for a more overarching issue. And for those of you who don't know, Beirut's around 2.4 million people. So, a lot of mix of Muslims and Christians, and within each a lot of sects that interplay. So the specific demographic that I would bring up is lower to mid-income men who very much like like the men in Kabul, I guess, need the spiritual and economic guidance. Obviously, I would also, if we were to think of a place, I would also include the importance of having women and children, the preteens as well from other cities as well. But I focus on this one because they hold so much decision-making power these days. And so, just kind of addressing and the ripple effect that comes with that, I think is important. And in terms of needs, very much, all of the above. But I would, there's a bit of a more critical need on the Beirut front to break sectarianism. And that also, relates to understanding how to self-empower. So I would say self-empowerment, just understanding how to shift, to use Islam, or spiritual guidance in general, or that North Star, in order to hold a stronger sense of control for one's life. And I think that's very important because it has a lot of implications. So, yeah.
Perfect. Yep. That makes a lot of sense. And we're going to, of course, include a lot of the elements above in terms of, physical space and space of learning. But that makes sense to focus on that specifically. Lastly, Boston.
Sure. So the demographic that I focused on are pre-college professionals before they have children, specific demographic. And there are 5 needs that I selected. So one is revisiting religious education in a non-judgmental space. So there's a wide range of religious knowledge. So even things like how to pray and fast are oftentimes lacking knowledge, but it's hard for that demographic to ask those questions because they don't find non-judgmental spaces to do so. Another is a space for dhikr, so remembering God. So oftentimes the masajid are places of prayer, but obviously the Zāwiyahs of our tradition were places of spiritual transformation, and so that would be an important element as well. Third, a space which models halal interaction between men and women, and it also facilitates halal marriages. that's a crisis of Western Muslims, probably all Muslims, but particularly Western Muslims. It'd be nice to have a space which models how that should happen in a halal but modern context. Fourth, a space which offers a connection to mental health resources. So that's a huge crisis of all societies nowadays. But oftentimes there is a lack of a Muslim articulation of what that means and how to access those resources. Then lastly, a space which offers a language and channel for political and social organization. And I mentioned that because America is a highly political place, as everyone knows, and almost all of that happens in a non-Muslim setting. So Muslims obviously care about the world and their community, but there are very, very few Muslim articulations of what that looks like and how they can do that in a way that's rooted in Islam. So it'd be very nice to have a space where Muslims who care about the world can come and supercharge their activism with an Islamic lens.
Thank you so much. Can you just read the demographic?
Sure.
Is it pre-college or post-college?
Post-college, pre-children.
Okay.
Because once people have kids, then I feel like everything changes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So we've gone around the room and we've highlighted quite a few needs. There's a lot of them, as I mentioned, have a lot of overlap amongst the cities, and some of them are quite particular to either a particular city or a particular demographic. But it seems that a lot of the demographics that we're focusing on generally young people. And as we ideate and go forward, I want to call out a couple of things. The first thing is that the demographics obviously are quite wide in general, but a legitimate focus on older people may be an interesting avenue to explore, or a secondary avenue. And then we had it called out in a few of the examples as well, but also maybe just focusing on this, which is there is obviously a primary demographic that has certain needs, but they might want to serve a secondary demographic, so serve the local people who might be less economically empowered, less fortunate in many ways. So that's just something that I want us to keep in mind. Perfect. So hopefully this has been helpful just to get some ideas in terms of needs and who would be ideating for. I want to move on to the next section, which is slightly independent, and a representative from Muscat started highlighting this. We won't spend too long on this, maybe about 5 or 6 minutes, and it'll just be an opportunity for people to call out any examples that they've been to and what worked well, what didn't work well, and where his role was fulfilled. So I'm going to start making some inputs over here, and I'm just going to put in the first one that we had, which was the Diwans in, I think I'm just going to say Oman in general. So,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yes. What worked well? I mean, it's very objective because every majlis or a diwan has a certain, let's say, direction of what the flow is. So I've been to some that are very spiritual based, dhikr based, where it's a lot about Islamic teachings, and it's not your typical studies that you would find in school, for example. Like in my case, it's the things that we never get to discuss in an educational institution. But there are things that I would say, I know most of us have listed younger demographics and people, but I think it's because of most of us are young, and it's subjects that touch upon young men and women, on how to deal with daily life issues using Islamic teachings. And for example, I've been to one majlis where there was this guy that came in. He's a specialist just to talk about like the taxes in Islam. That's something I never thought about before, and it was so intriguing and interesting at the end of the discussion, where I actually learned a lot from. So I think that worked well, which is something the written part that we're typically exposed to. What didn't work well, again, it's all subjective to what the majlis is about. So it can be, it depends on the person, I guess. It can be something that you don't relate to, or something that you have no interest in, or just is not useful at the end of the day. And sometimes it doesn't really touch on things that are meaningful to the time and space you're in. Okay, thank you. You made it very easy with their definition there. Yeah.
Perfect. I guess now we'll just open it up to the floor for a few minutes, just for people to shout out. And as our representative from Muscat mentioned, highlighting some models that people in the room may not be aware of, because personally, I think that's quite an interesting concept in general. So yeah, please do share your thoughts and experience of these spaces. Don't all shout out at once.
I'm happy to share briefly about the Ta'leef Collective. So the Ta'leef Collective in America is perhaps the first major third space. It's founded by an individual, Osama Cannon, rahimahullah. And what worked well, it was a beautiful space. It brought tons of people together. It brought tons of people back to Islam. It was super non-judgmental. That was a big part of his pedagogy. Yes. What didn't work well, part of the design, basically, Ta'leef was very much connected to an individual personality, and once that person moved on, then the institution suffered, and so there was a risk of sustainability which was realized.
Thank you so much. Any other experiences people would like to share?
I have a very brief experience. There's a cafe in Amman called Jadal, and it's, I don't know if like calling it a cafe is really appropriate, but it's a really cool space that's sort of multi-use. They do have a cafe, and they've also got like a little library space. It's nice because they often have speakers or bands or sort of just like little cultural events that can be educational. And my favorite part is they have like a rooftop garden. So it's not really open for like community gardening as far as I know. It's pretty tiny, but it's nice to just have that. It's a very three-dimensional space, and it's very grounded, I feel like. Yeah, I think the main what doesn't work well for me is accessibility in terms of location. It's very much in the city center, but you kind of have to walk to it. There are like loads of stairs in all directions, and the door is super easy to miss. And because Amman is very much like a driving city, you'd have to like drive to a space and park and walk like another 10 minutes and whatever. So it's kind of a hassle. Yeah, but I guess that also makes it quite cozy. So yeah.
Sounds interesting. We'll take one more if there are any thoughts from the room, otherwise we can move on.
I can speak to or Sensar, did you want to go ahead? I saw you unmute.
Go ahead.
We can take two, it's fine.
Okay, that sounds good. I'll speak quickly to the IC NYU Islamic Center of New York University. I think it's a fantastic space. It has been an entry point for a lot of folks rediscovering or discovering Islam, and it's been a very non-judgmental space to go at any point. And I think that embodies elements of a Zāwiyah where you can go and you feel comfortable and you feel accommodated and accepted without having to do anything. You can just stay in the space and do what you need to do. There's also great programming specific to certain groups. There are nights for Latino Muslims, or nights, or like there are conversations, and so they have all of these great programmings. And also they have a great leader in Imam Latif, and I think that he really brings the community together, and I think that's a really important part of spaces like this when you have a strong leader. I don't necessarily have something in particular that didn't work well. I'm a huge fan. I think this is more general, I think, to certain spaces that take place in larger areas where, and I'm speaking as a Filipino Muslim, it's when you don't, I guess, see yourself a lot in the space. And I've spoken to some people in this call about this. It's sometimes difficult to separate culture and religion. And when you're navigating that and you can't see yourself in a certain space, and this isn't by no fault of this particular organization, it's just the larger community around it, it's more challenging to navigate that. So I think maybe, I don't know, initiatives to bring certain minority communities together in order to see yourself in the space.
Perfect. Thanks. Lastly, our representative from Kabul.
So I was thinking of a number of different places that I went to and really appreciated. Sheikh Yahya Rodas's Maqasid in rural Pennsylvania, or Dr. Shad al-Masri's, he has this daily event in New Jersey as well. And then I realized all of them were graduates of the same place in Hadramaut in Yemen. And so if any of you have not been there yet, it's that to me would be the ideal example, open to anyone. And you go before the prayers or after the prayers, and it breaks out into zikr circles and classes and just an incredible energy. They have free food for everyone that's there and during the day. They do have a canteen in the back as well, where you can get some chai and sit together with others. But that model is just incredible, and it's led by Habib Umar there.
Perfect. So there's something in the chat. I just want to quickly. Oh, yes, please, George. Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, so I thought I'd just put a message in. But when Bear was speaking a moment ago about the ICNYU, it was reminding me of somewhere. I know I'm not strictly representing anyone anywhere here, but I'm based in Oxford, and just throughout this discussion, I've kind of been thinking about spaces we do have in Oxford, and again, it's perhaps one that's a bit more, like you said, of the Brompton one, a bit more out of left field because it's a church. But there's a church here called St Aldate's. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Oxford or not, whether you've heard of that name, St Aldate's. And they have, so one of my friends goes there, and they run all kinds of initiatives that are somewhat similar to that. And I know it's kind of unusual for a church, because I think the associations we have with churches, especially in Britain, is very sort of formal and ceremonial, but they do so many different things to try and like integrate the community into their faith initiatives and stuff. So one of the things that they do is like they'll offer free coffee and free ice cream, and so that encourages people to stay around afterwards for discussions and things, and it's very community orientated. And one thing that sort of strikes me about that is that for someone like me, so I'm a white British Muslim. I grew up Catholic, although not particularly strongly practicing. And so I never sort of regularly went to church or that. But what that sort of makes me think of is that it's difficult in Britain. In the Muslim community in Britain is mostly first or second generation immigrants, which is fine, and that's understandable, and it's understandable why. But I think that means that sometimes there's less space for and I don't, obviously, I'm like the least oppressed group out there, so I don't mean it in that sense. But it's interesting how sometimes, even though that's what I was just speaking about was a church, sometimes because the Christian community is so historically so much more established, there are those spaces for them in a way that there perhaps aren't for the Islamic community in the same way. There's a mosque around the corner from me, for example, beautiful mosque, very nice architectural building, and they have classes and stuff, but it's a heavily Punjabi community. And so whilst there's absolutely no exclusion there, it's somewhat difficult, like we were just discussing a moment ago, for people to feel like they can come into that. And it's not, like I said, it's not a deliberately exclusionary thing, but I think sometimes when spaces are orientated towards specifically making people feel welcome and non-judgmental, and so that St. Aldate's, the church I was talking about a moment ago, I think kind of strikes that interesting balance. During their sermons, they start with scripture and then extrapolate from that, and so it's never abstract either. They try and speak to you on your level, and that's something that is quite engaging. But the limitations of that, just to kind of wrap up, as I'm thinking out loud, is that whilst they run classes and things, that specific example, all of that is fairly orientated around specific services, so Sunday services. And so a space that's not necessarily our equivalent would be doing things around Jummah, but obviously you want that sort of thing to be available outside of those times as well. So I don't know if those reflections are useful, but that was just running through my head. Sorry, I know I wasn't specifically representing Oxford, but inshallah that's perhaps useful.
Very useful. Thank you so much, George. And yeah, I guess there's a lot of similarity between that and HTP that I mentioned earlier as well. Sounds like it's quite similar. But it's an interesting point around having a welcoming space for minorities, for all sorts of people. And I think that's what also we heard in the previous example about, it was a general comment about spaces. Right, so this, as well as some of the other spaces that we have explored, gives us a good grounding of what works well, what doesn't work well. And as we continue to the next section, which is to ideate on an ideal Zāwiyah of our time, what elements does it need? How do these rank? What does the physical space look and feel like? And what's the long-term vision of the project? We'll spend about 20 or so minutes, or just under 20 minutes on this. So it'll mainly be a discussion, and I'll put some ideas on the board. Now, one thing to mention is that if in the demographics and the needs that you mentioned earlier on, it's clear that everybody is tackling this from a very different angle. And so for this to be useful, we'd like to keep this at a relatable level or an applicable level to all of the examples. So for example, an element could be a physical space. We can then get down to what that physical space looks like in terms of feel. Is it something that's very rusty? Is it something that's very simple, or does it have to be elaborate? And I guess for each demographic in each city and each need, that physical space will look different for sure. But nonetheless, there are some key themes of what makes a good third space or good other space, as well as what doesn't. So just wanted to start collecting some of these, and we can get ideas from across the board. So yeah, I'm just going to open it up to the floor. I think there was lots of ideas that we've bashed around over the last 40 or so minutes. So let's get started. Feel free to shout out.
I can start. I would mention 3 elements, probably relatability. We've touched upon this a bit in the earlier parts of the discussion. So that's just whether it's specialty coffee, as you mentioned in one of your discussions, all the way to really understanding, what the minority groups may feel, or what thoughts people have coming into this space. So really fostering that type of space that allows that doesn't have someone feel unsafe to say a certain opinion or so. And the fact of the matter is, that probably brings me to the next one, which is inclusivity. And inclusivity works both ways, right? It's both, being inclusive of different minority groups, different, people, whether they're reverts or other, but then also people who are struggling with their faith. Despite that coming into, despite that potentially contradicting some other people who may be in the same space. So really understanding how to kind of meld those together is very important, and that has an implication on how the physical space should actually look like or how it should be managed. But that's more on the implication front. I don't know if you have you clearly have approached a very nice strategy consulting approach to this, baseline, benchmark, and strategizing. So I don't know if you have a different category for this, but that's in terms of implications. And then the third one I would add is I don't know if this is how we would take this, but the decentralization of power, and maybe there's another way to word this, but what that means is, rather than having one lecturer who is kind of talking to the masses and just having everyone just listen, fostering a dialogue that comes from different angles, that allows different people to say takes, and making it more of a multi-channel conversation.
Yep. I guess that's an interesting one. Would good governance cover that, or do you think that governance is slightly separate to what you're talking about?
Now you're really being a consultant. I love it. That is really good. Good governance would definitely cover that. Yes.
Great.
We've seen this, because in places like, Faisal and I were actually on a consulting project in Mecca. And of all, the holiest of cities, Mecca doesn't have one space for people to actually come together and speak together. And a beautiful holy space, as it is, it doesn't have that type of Zāwiyah that we speak of. So it's
definitely. Now, I want to just reflect on your second point of inclusivity, because you're right, there is this tension between serving a specific demographic with a specific need whilst being inclusive. And I don't think the two of you should be exclusive. I think you can do both at the same time, but it takes a lot of planning and takes a lot of thought. And I think that's probably something that we need to take away and think of how that actually works. But no, thank you so much for those reflections. Very, very helpful. We'll move on to anyone else with some elements.
I think this was mentioned in several of the examples that were made, was just the quality of the space, having the space that's comfortable and attractive, people want to be there. The environment, I think, is really, really important. How people sit and eat, or so that the quality of the space makes a really big difference. And it's reflection to outside and people wanting to come and wanting to visit and bring others.
Thanks. Any others? We heard about programming and content. I guess I would separate that from relatability, which is, you know, so I'll put that down. Any other kind of thoughts?
This is a half-baked thought, so just apologies if it's not coherent. So something about so the problem that I'm trying to articulate is that in other spaces that I've seen from other religions, things become so inclusive that they're not even religious anymore. So it's just, and so how do we think about that? And so it's like, it's so big tent that like at some point you're like, what are we doing here? So something about purpose. So being clear about purpose, and our purpose is to help each other go to heaven, or a purpose. And so just to be clear about being purposeful of the space.
That is a really good one.
This is also a half-baked thought. I think connected.
Coming.
And actually, I know I'm talking for Manila today, but I live in New York, so I'll speak to something that I'm seeing in the US. I think the Philippines is actually quite good at this, which is connecting to elders. I think we have really good social structures to include elders in our community and make sure that they feel heard and important, and they feel like they are respected as providers of wisdom. I don't feel that as much in the US. And in one of the readings that you sent, Tariq, thought that was really inspiring, and how, you know, I think similar to an earlier comment, power is not centralized, and that there are many teachers. And so how do we include the elders in the community?
Thanks. I'm trying to find the right word. I guess it's slightly different to mentorship. It's more, yes, it's guidance from elders. Anything else?
I suppose a similar point, the sort of guidance from elders is just sort of I don't know if, again, like an encouragement for I guess for like mixing and discussion, because I think a few people also pointed this out of having distinct communities or like sub-communities, and how to get them to engage with each other, because you can also, from seeing different perspectives, different approaches, maybe learn a lot. So actually having an incentive to break out of your little cliques or whatever it may be, or like not to be shy, maybe is a nicer way to put it.
Great. I just want to quickly go to some of our needs, just to see if there was anything else. What about this idea of training, in training or learning in whichever capacity that might be? So learning, for example, it could be languages, could be Islam, but training the self, a place that fulfills that purpose. I see a few nods. I'll add that down. Perhaps I'll just call this spiritual and social training. Okay, great. I think that's probably enough to go with at the moment. And now this is kind of the harder part, which is how do we rank these and where do we place them out of the how do we rank them comparatively to each other? So this is obviously going to be hard to do that much in a group. So I'm going to put something out there, and I'd like people to tell me whether we think this is the most important thing or not. And all of these are very, very important. And I think I'm struggling to find which one.
I think I would start with purpose.
Purpose.
If we don't have the right purpose, then everything else kind of falls away. So,
Great.
but that's me and intention. What we're trying to, where we're trying to go with it.
Yep. And yeah, exactly what the purpose of the space and it is perfect. Yep. I think we don't probably have to debate that one as much. What do you think comes next?
Maybe good governance would be after that. Like, if whoever's in charge is doing poorly, then you can't really have anything else.
Exactly. That's so true, because yeah, this is one of the enablers. Yep. Unless anyone else thinks that there's something else should be above that, please shout out. What about relatability? Relatability. Do you think that's quite high or not so high as others?
From my perspective, I think that makes sense to be perhaps the next one, because this is a unique problem that this space is solving, where a masjid can be a place for spiritual training and the home can be a place for other things, for example. But a problem is that those spaces are not relatable to our target demographic.
I see some nods, so I'm going to put that down. We'll maybe do one or two more, but just keep the rest on the board. What do we think is kind of number 4?
I would say good programming. Because I think if you have good programming and their space is okay, I think you would still come. I think programming is really what goes people to a space.
Yep, thank you very much. And finally, what's going to make up number 5? We've got 2 elements over here that relate to. Well, actually, this doesn't actually relate that much to space. This is closer to inclusivity.
I think the element of spiritual and social growing and improving and learning is related to good programming. So I don't know if you want to put that together, or is another one there? Because if you're learning, you have good mentorship programs and training programs. That's good programming as well.
Yep, definitely, that's true. Yeah, maybe we'll put these side by side. 4 and 5. What about one thing we talked about space actually quite a lot, and we've talked about it basically the whole for this whole seminar, this whole webinar. But actually, when we come to it, it hasn't been one of the highest ranked things. What are our thinkings on quality space, quality physical space, and amenities? Because we saw some examples where this wasn't really important at all, where you had people gathering without even a permanent physical space. And on the other hand, with some of the examples, we saw that there is a 24/7 purpose-built space that's only used very, very infrequently. Does anyone have any thoughts on space and whether that may be, does it come in mid-rank, or does it come in even further than that?
I have a few thoughts about space. I think definitely the quality in terms of, I forget who mentioned this, but sort of having somewhere that you feel safe in and that caters to your basic needs. So just basic cleanliness and all of that, I think that's important. I think depending on where you are, maybe in your spirituality, or where you are in terms of engagement with the community, can really affect the importance of a space. I know that when I'm new to a place, you can't help but judge the book by its cover, because that's all you really have. But once you integrate, it's much easier to let go of certain needs. So I guess, yeah, if I don't know how I would rank it, but it's a very confusing point to have. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, and maybe we'll just leave it there for now. And when we think about think about testing, and when we think about how to get these projects off the ground, it can just be a thought that we have. So I want to quickly move on to the the last element of this, which will be very, very short, and just talk very, very briefly about next steps, and Hamza will wrap up for us. So we have a list of elements, and as I mentioned, these are going to be very, very these need to be very tailored to the specific demographic and the specific needs that they have. But hopefully there's something that are a starting point. When we talk about actually getting started, a lot of these projects that we mentioned, either together or in the first half of this session, all started off quite simply, and they probably all did start off without a physical space or without any structured program, but they started off with that niyyah, with that purpose, and with that drive to serve a specific need of a specific part of the community. That's something to keep in mind. And then these are questions that maybe we'll take one or two thoughts from the floor, which is, what does an MVP look like? So if we had to launch something tomorrow, what can we do with very minimal resources? So for example, do we need a physical space? It sounds like maybe we don't. Do we need a specific governance structures? Perhaps not immediately, but it sounds like we'll need something quite soon just to make sure that things don't get out of check. So 2 or 3 minutes of reflections on this. What do we need to get something off the ground tomorrow with limited resources?
Just a quick thought. I think one thing that's necessary is relates to a point in the previous page about connection to elders, and more specifically, a connection to the Prophet Muhammad, ﷺ. And so on all of the models which you mentioned, every one of those has a leader who has a chain of transmission back to the Prophet Muhammad. And so I think if we don't have that, then we're sort of just whirling in midair and not having grounding. So, and the way to get that is to connect with a tradition which has a chain of transmission back to the Prophet Muhammad.
Thanks. Yes, and that makes a lot of sense. I guess it's also tied in. Well, it is probably separate to that niyyah. Actually, it would be something separate. Yeah. Any other thoughts on practicalities?
I think if you were like really to start something tomorrow, something quite important would be to make sure that it's sort of targeted enough. You don't want it to be so, like we're starting a Zāwiyah and then no one really knows what's going on, and it's so open that it gets lost. I guess that ties into purpose, but yeah, I think you'd want to start off with like a very clear statement of what this is trying to be. And also just maybe thinking a little bit more openly about who might be interested. Like it's not always the people you'd expect. I know a lot of my friends I speak to, and they give me really unexpected reflections, and I'm like, oh well, like everyone I meet I seem to learn something from. So I think having that openness of who might be a part of it, and then also having a clear vision of what you can sort of tell them.
Yep, that's a really good thought, because this is in the spirit of testing, because these are hypotheses that we have, that a certain demographic has a certain need, but without actually testing that, without putting something in a very, very simple way to them, and maybe this could be just hosting a small event in a park or something, without seeing that there's that need. We may be building something for a need that doesn't exist for that target population, and it could, as we had, change in terms of who that target population might be. So that's a very, very good thought. And I think the other thing that you mentioned around taking a very specific need for a very specific demographic, maybe just starting off with one, and having having one small thing that this space or this organization, this institution solves, no matter how small it is, that's probably the best way to start. And then from there, building upon that. I guess that's just how great companies are built. They serve the need of a very specific need of a very specific user. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. And obviously, this is just the beginning. This is just a quick session to get our collective thoughts on paper. But I wanted to thank you all for taking the time out and sharing your thoughts with us all, and for being open and minded, respectful, and bringing these ideas together. We pray that, inshallah, these ideas will come to fruition over some time. And I guess it's on us to think about all these elements and how we can be of service in our communities. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Hamza, who will give a quick closing thought.
Inshallah. Barakallah feekum. Sayyid Tariq, really thanks. We're so grateful for your time and the way that you structured this conversation. I think it left us all with something to reflect on, and to reflect on our communities, and to reflect on what role we can play in being of service, as you mentioned. And I really love the point about sometimes, there's certain demographics or types of people that we might not expect, and there may be a need that, we might find ourselves in a position where we have the resources and the tools to fulfill some of those needs. And as you mentioned, I really thought it was a very beautiful way to put it, that we can all start thinking about the MVP, or the minimum viable product. It can be simple, but I think the niyyah is definitely important. And I loved also the point about having some connection back to the Prophet ﷺ, because ultimately that is the greatest source of wisdom. That ultimately, if our spaces are not pulling from that, then we're missing something very big. And as you mentioned, then you might as there are other spaces that fill other niche needs. But this feels like it's something that we can all find an application for in our communities. So barakallah feekum for your time, and thank you everyone who attended and shared honestly and sincerely your thoughts. We just wanted to also, before we finally wrap up, just mention that our organization, Shajarat Al Nur, we are open for collaborations. We are a platform that aims to host webinars, live events, workshops, further majalis or roundtable discussions similar to this. And we're also open to, we're seeking patrons as well, as we seek to grow as an organization. And inshallah, one day the aim would be for physical spaces, and maybe inshallah this can serve as a model for what that may look like in the future. So jazakumullah khair jami'an, and we thank you for your time.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد السابق للخلق نوره ورحمة للعالمين ظهوره عدد من مضى من خلقك ومن بقي ومن سعد منهم ومن شقي صلاة تستغرق العد وتحيط بالحد صلاة لا غاية لها ولا منتهى ولا انقضاء صلاة دائمة بدوامك وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما مثل ذلك.